Well, I always suspected that at some point on the channel I would be doing a video about Saudi, or in this case Qatari, investment into rugby. We've seen it in so many other sports, and a big story in the Daily Telegraph over here in the UK today about Qatar and World Rugby and Sanzaar and the Six Nations being in negotiations, an £800 million offer on the table to host a finals series essentially for the new Nations Championship, which is the Rugby Championship and the Six Nations, and the first in each playing each other, second play each other, third, and so on and so forth, which is something World Rugby are bringing in. The question now is that going to be in Qatar? Should rugby take the money and go and play in the Middle East? Lots to unpack in this video. I reckon pretty much all. I reckon about 98% of the comments that I have seen on this have been incredibly negative, and I will try and balance the two sides of the argument in this video and give my view on it at the end, but I'm sure many of you will feel really strongly about this, so the comment section is where you can give me your views. Do you think, given the financial position of rugby, that they should take the money if it's on offer and take this kind of Nations Championship, the Super Bowl of rugby, I think is how it's been termed in that Telegraph article? Do you think they should take that to Qatar, or do you think rugby needs to stay well away from this? Put your comment down below. Also, whilst you're here, like the video and subscribe to the channel. So yeah, as I say, I kind of suspected this would happen at some stage. Over here in England, we have seen heavy links with Saudi Arabia looking to invest in Newcastle Falcons, the team in the Premiership this season. So that's kind of bubbling along. And given the fact that we have seen tennis, golf, football, I mean, so many different sports, athletics, all have offers of big money to take their sports, whether it be with the public investment fund in Saudi Arabia, whether it is in Qatar. These sorts of conversations were always going to be on the table. So on the whole, I think there's a lot more arguments for not doing this, and I will get onto those. But let's start with the money straight away. As I say, £800 million, $1 billion US, is a size, is the biggest draw, I think, for the various unions involved in this decision-making process, for obvious reasons. And given the financial situation of rugby, I don't think it can be entirely sniffed at, because we've seen clubs go bust in England. We have seen, whether it be the New Zealand Rugby Union or in South Africa or the RFU here in England, post losses, really struggle financially over the last few years. So if this is such a ridiculous, sizable amount of money that it could shore up the financial footing of those unions and therefore the games in those countries, then I can massively understand why they will consider it, as unpopular as that is going to be with an awful lot of people. The big thing for me, I think, with the money, because look, I get it, it's quite unpalatable to a lot of us, but that is an obscene amount of money. But the big thing for me is, how does that get distributed and where does it go? Whereas, again, using an example of in England with CVC, the private equity firm that have came in and bought a stake in the Gallagher Premiership in particular, all of the money from that essentially got hoovered up during COVID just to support the clubs and prop the clubs up and fill their losses. And now it's kind of like, well, where has that all gone? And you've given away a big chunk of your commercial deal in that instance. So if this sort of money was on the table and was going to the unions, I don't want to just see it go to the wrong areas, I suppose, whatever that might be. You want to see it get down to the grassroots. And importantly, I think you want to see it go to other unions, which is the thing which is maybe a romantic view of it. But if there is this massive influx of money into the game, rather than just going to the richest unions already, there needs to be some way, I think, of distributing it out across the game more broadly. And for those unions that do get it, I'd love to see it injected into the grassroots and the pathways and the community game, rather than just, I don't know, going to the players or going to a whole load of new hospitality boxes that they can sell at whatever stadium. So I think it has to be invested in the right way. The other thing, which a lot of people might argue, if you are in favour of this idea, I suppose, is all the other sports I mentioned. All the other sports that have been there and done it. And does rugby have the moral superiority, I suppose, to turn it down? Another way of flipping that question of actually, should rugby be the one sport that does take a stand? Is that what you want to see from your sport? An opportunity of leadership to say, no, we aren't taking the money because of all the issues that I am going to come on to in a moment. But I think there will be people that say, well, other sports have cashed in. Why shouldn't rugby? It would be absolutely foolish, as everyone else makes a lot of money from the investment that countries in the Middle East are looking to put into sport. Rugby would be a fool not to do that, especially when legally there is nothing against it in terms of businesses being allowed and governments themselves being allowed to do business with those countries. Why should it be up to sports to be the moral barometer, I suppose, would be a counter-argument. But let me get on to the issues. I can feel the frustration in the comments for those of you that are saying, no, nonsense, there are so many issues. And I get it, there are. Obviously the human rights issues, the moral issues, which we saw aplenty when it came to the build-up to the Qatar World Cup, the Football World Cup, whether it be the migrant workers, whether it be the rights of the gay community. All of that sort of stuff are obviously huge issues. And I think a big part of this is rugby is a sport that likes to build itself up as rugby values, which frankly, I always think is kind of nonsense anyway. It's kind of marketing jargon and is a kind of moral superiority. The sport sometimes people like to think of, oh, rugby is a different sport. If they were to go down this route, I think it massively undervalues the very principles that a lot of these unions who would be taking the money pride themselves on and say that they are built around in terms of the community game and what the sport is all about. I think it would hugely undervalue that. The other issue, and actually quite a major issue for me here, is if it's in Qatar, who is going to go? Now, there are big expat populations of Brits and Kiwis and Aussies and South Africans that live in the Middle East. You see it with the Dubai Sevens, for any of you that have ever been there. I know when I went, I was struck by the amount of people that were clearly lived in Dubai, but they were from the UK or from other nations. So there would be an audience of sorts in that area of the world. Maybe they could get there. Another part of the argument for why the Middle East is it's kind of midway between Europe and midway between New Zealand and Australia. So geographically it makes sense to a degree, but I would have major concerns over who's going to go and therefore are the stadiums going to be empty? And actually, what would this product look like? Would it actually be any good? Would there actually be any atmosphere whatsoever? The Football World Cup is one thing. The Football World Cup is such a ginormous event that people are going to go. Even though many people objected to it being in Qatar, loads of people went. And actually, I know plenty of people that went and they said, despite all those concerns, it was brilliant. But I just don't know if you would have the same thing with this, with it being, what is it? I think it's supposed to be is it every 2 years? I forget the exact format now. I need to double check that. But how many people are going to be going? What sort of atmosphere would there be? Like some of the big boxing bouts we've seen. Again, speaking to people that have been at them, saying it all can just be a bit flat. Some of them have been good, some of them not so good. So what's the actual product look like? I suppose that is almost what it boils down to here for me. And I'm not convinced how good it would be. Aside from the issues of it actually being in Qatar, there are also rugby issues to consider here, which is something to consider regardless of where it was hosted. But first of all, does anyone actually want the format? Does it appeal to you to see the first place team from the kind of Northern Hemisphere teams and the first place team from the Rugby Championship teams play each other, but then also second beat second, third beat third, fourth beat fourth, etc., etc.? How much appetite is there for this format and for these games to happen? The other thing as well is extra matches. Extra matches for players that are already playing way too much. And the final point on this in terms of the rugby point of view is promotion relegation, which is something people have spoken about before, I know, with World Rugby proposing this, of how accessible is it to, I think Japan and Fiji are probably expected to join the Rugby Championship team, so that becomes a six, and obviously with the Six Nations, but for Samoa or Portugal or whoever it might be, what's the pathway for those teams being able to be a part of that? And there is, I think, a general feel that it's just not really there at the moment. It is just serving the big unions and the most lucrative unions to their own ends and for them to grow without growing the game as a whole. So those are my kind of general thoughts on it. Do let me know in the comments if you feel I've missed anything or some other key points. I suppose if I was to give my conclusion, I feel like I'm against it because I'm just not convinced it'll be that great, ultimately. And look, I know there are moral issues, and they are really important issues as well. It's important that we have those conversations. But for me, it actually kind of boils down to the fact that if you don't have a product that looks good and works and is packed out stadiums and has people attending and looks great on TV, a product that engages people, then can it really be successful? Eventually that will dry up. And if this is being played out in half-empty stadiums with no real atmosphere and no real rugby fans, no fans from from the teams competing actually in attendance, then I'm just not convinced how successful it will be. Their theory will be it's kind of a festival of rugby, a Super Bowl of rugby, where it plays over 3 games. We have 2 matches each day, building up to that kind of grand final. So that's my general view on it. Let me know. I can imagine it is going to be a topic of hot discussion and of a lot of contention. Hopefully in this video I've kind of balanced out where the 2 arguments are. Whichever side of it you fall upon, hopefully you can kind of see some of the arguments for and some of the arguments against. But at the moment, as I say, I'm just not convinced that it would be all that good, essentially. So comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.